pa kunja bihari. Gopi jana vallabha girivaradari. Yasoda nandana braja jana ranjana. Yamuna tira vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gonitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, good morning. Thank you very kindly for attending Srimad Bhagavatam class. Today we're reading from Canto 10, chapter 87, and the text is 30. And it actually is on the board. 10.87.30. Okay. Aparimita dhruvas tanu prito yadi sarvagatas. Tarhina sasyateti niyamo dhruva nitarata. Ajani chayan mayam tad avimucha niyanti bhavet. Samam anujanatam yat amatam matadushtaya. Aparimita dhruvastanu brito yadi sarvagatas. Tarhina sasyateti niyamo dhruva nitarata. Ajani chayan mayam tad avimucha niyanti bhavet. Samam anujanatam yad amatam matadushtaya. Aparimita dhruvastanu brito yadi sarvagatas. Tarhina sasyateti niyamo dhruva nitarata. Ajani chayan mayantad avirmucha niyantir bhavet. Samam anujanatam yad amatam matadushtaya. Please chant. Please. Aparimita dhruvastanu brito yadi sarvagatas. Tarhina sasyateti niyamo dhruva nitarata. Ayani chayan mayam tad avirmucha niyantir bhavet. Samam anujanatam yadamatam matadushtaya. Aparimita dhruvastanu brito yadi sarvagatas. Tarhina sasyateti niyamo dhruva nitarata. Ajani chayan mayam tad avimucha niyantir bhavet. Samamanujanam yad amatamata dushtatasyam. Thank you very much for chanting. The word-for-word translation is as follows. And this is the disciples of Srila Prabhupada doing the translation and the purport. Aparimita, countless. Dhruva, permanent. Tanubrita, the embodied living entities. Yadi, if. Sarvagata, omnipresent. Tani, then. Na, not. Shasyata, sovereignty. Iti, such. Niyamaha, rule. Dhruva, O unchanging one. Na, not. Itarata, otherwise. Jani, was generated. Cha, and. Yatmayam, from whose substance. Tat, from that. Avimuchya, not separating itself. Niyantir, regulator. Bhavet, must be. Samam, equally present. Anujanatam, of those who supposedly know. Yat, which. Amatam, misunderstood. Matam, of what is known. Dushtataya, because of the imperfection. So here is the translation by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. And this is one of the Shrutis talking. If the personified Vedas, if the countless living entities were all pervading and possessed forms that never changed, you could not possibly be their absolute ruler, O immutable one. But since they are your localized expansions and their forms are subject to change, you do control them. Indeed, that which supplies the ingredients for the generation of something is necessarily its controller, because a product never exists apart from its ingredient cause. It is simply illusion for someone to think that he knows the Supreme Lord, who is equally present in each of his expansions, since whatever knowledge one gains by material means must be imperfect. So here is the purport, a little long. Because the conditioned soul cannot directly understand the Supreme, the Vedas commonly refer to that Supreme Truth in such impersonal terms as Brahman and Om Tat Sat. If an ordinary scholar presumes to know the confidential meaning of these symbolic references, he should be rejected as an impostor in the words of Sri Kena Upanishad 2.1. Yadi manyase suvedeti dabram evapi nunam tvam veta brahmano rupam yad asya tvam yad asya deveshu. Translation: if you think you know Brahman well, then your knowledge is very meager. If you think you can identify Brahman's form from among the demigods, indeed you know but little. And again, Yasya matam tasya matam matam yasya navedasa avignatam vigyanatam vignatam avijanatam. Translation: whoever denies having any opinion of his own about the supreme truth is correct in his opinion, whereas one who has his own opinion about the supreme does not know him. He is unknown to those who claim to know him and can only be known by those who do not claim to know him. It's the Kena Upanishad 2:3. Acharya Sridhar Swami gives the following explanation of this verse. Many philosophers have studied the mysteries of life from various perspectives and have formed widely differing theories. The Advaita Mayavadis, for example, propose that there is only one living being and one power of illusion, avidya, that covers him, producing the appearance of plurality. But this hypothesis leads to the absurd conclusion that when any one living being becomes liberated, everyone obtains liberation. If, on the other hand, there are many avidyas to cover the one living being, each avidya will cover only some part of him, and we would have to talk about his becoming partly liberated at particular times, while his other parts remain in bondage. This is also obviously absurd. Thus, the plurality of living beings is an unavoidable conclusion. Furthermore, there are other theoreticians, namely the proponents of Nyaya and Vaisheshika, who claim that the Jiva soul is infinite in size. If souls were infinitesimal, these scholars argue they would not pervade their own bodies, whereas if they were of medium size, they would be divisible into parts and thus could not be eternal, at least according to the axioms of Nyaya Vaisheshika metaphysics. But if the numerous eternal Jiva souls are each infinitely large, how could they be covered by any power of bondage, whether belonging to Vidya or to the Supreme Lord himself? So according to this theory, there can be no illusion for the soul, no limitations from which to be liberated. The infinite souls must eternally remain as they are without change. This would mean that the souls would all be equal to God, since he would have no scope for controlling these all-pervading, unchanging rivals. The Vedic Shruti mantras, which affirm unequivocally the mastery of the Lord over the individual souls, cannot be validly contradicted. A true philosopher must accept the statements of Shruti as reliable authority on all matters they touch. Certainly, in numerous places, the Vedic literature contrasts the Supreme Lord's perpetual, unchanging oneness with the ever-changing embodiment of living beings caught up in the cycle of birth and death. Srila Sridhar Swami prays, Antaryanta sarva lokasya gita, Shrutya yuktya chaivam eva vaseyaha, ya sarva gnya sarva shakti nishrimha, Shrimantam tam chetasai valambe. Translation: in my heart, I take shelter of him who is glorified as the inner controller of all the worlds, and whom the Vedas ascertain in truth through logical reasoning. He is Nishrimha, the omniscient and omnipotent Lord of the goddess of fortune. Om Jnana-timirandasya Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam. Vandeham Shri Guru Shuta Padakamlam Shri Gurum Vaishnavam Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitam Shah. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagat Pate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavan Ishvari Vishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Taribhyas Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimata Ramapada Swami iti namine Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimata Bhaktivedanta Swami iti namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I'll read the translation once again so we have it clear. If the countless living entities were all pervading and possessed forms that never change, you could not possibly be their absolute ruler, O immutable one. But since they are your localized expansions and their forms are subject to change, you do control them. Indeed, that which supplies the ingredients for the generation of something is necessarily its controller, because a product never exists apart from its ingredient cause. It is simply illusion for someone to think that he knows the Supreme Lord, who is equally present in each of his expansions, since whatever knowledge one gains by material means must be imperfect. So, going into the context of this particular statement by this Shruti, one can recall that the original question asked by King Parikshit was the following: how can the Vedas directly describe the supreme absolute truth who cannot be described by words? The Vedas are limited to describing the qualities of material nature, but the Supreme is devoid of these qualities, being transcendental to all material manifestations and their causes. So that was the question, the original question posed by King Parikshit to Sukadeva Goswami. And the response of the personified Vedas is to indicate, so they're responding. So all of them have this underlying theme, which is to indicate the supremacy of Krishna's form over all others. And the narration of the personified Vedas is the same narration, this was mentioned in yesterday's class, it's the same narration heard by Narada from Narayan Rishi, who then explained it to his disciple Vyasadeva. So now this narration is being narrated Srila Sukadeva Goswami to Maharaj Parikshit. So that's the context. So this particular Shruti, and there are 28 of them, 28 great Upanishads, this particular one looks at the differing philosophical theories on the jiva, who of course has accepted different moving and non-moving bodies. So of course the Shrutis, who are expansions of the Lord, they speak in order to harmonize the conclusion of all the Shrutis. So every one of them is doing that. They're harmonizing the conclusion of all the other Shrutis by delineating the essential qualities of the Lord, while at the same time they refute condemned opinions that do not meet their approval. So they do those things simultaneously. You'll notice in each of the Shruti's statements, glorifying the essential qualities of the Lord, refuting opinions that they're condemning and they don't meet their approval. So Srila Jiva Goswami, he notes particularly in relation to this verse that the Shrutis decide to define the Jiva in order to show that they should have bhakti for the Lord. So that's the underlying purpose here. There's a definition of the Jiva, and they want to show that just by this definition, there has to be some devotion for the Lord. So moving to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in Sarata Darshini, he has the Shruti saying the following. So this is quoting Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, putting in words what the Shrutis are saying. So we heard the particular statement from the translation. So this is how Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who's going even further back into the thinking of the Shrutis, how he's having the Shrutis articulating their thoughts. So the Advaita Mayavadis, so remember there's that thing of wanting to put across the supremacy of the Lord, and at the same time to actually show that certain other views that are not in agreement with the Shrutis need to be condemned. So here's the background thought of the Shrutis put across by Srila Vishwanath. The Advaita Mayavadis propose, for example, that there is only one living being and one power of illusion. Power of illusion, the word being avidya. So this is a hypothesis, and it leads to a particular conclusion that if you're talking about only one living being and one power of illusion, so it means that everybody is one, they're one living being, there's only one power of illusion, then, it's a hypothesis. This leads to a conclusion, and this was mentioned in the purport, that when any one jiva, so, we're seeing there are numerous jivas, but they're saying there's really one in the ultimate sense on an existential level. It means that when one jiva becomes liberated, so freed from the bondage of material life, then everyone attains liberation, because what happens to one must happen to all if there's only one living force and one power of illusion. So that's a particular theory and hypothesis from the Advaita Mayavadis. On the other hand, so this is looking at a different hypothesis. If there are many avidyas, so same kind of idea, if there are many forms of ignorance that cover the spirit soul, then each avidya will cover only some part of the jiva, because if there's many kinds of ignorance, so it may not be that the same kind of ignorance is covering each jiva. So then liberation would be in parts, because one would become free of some ignorance, but the others would still remain. So the conclusion based on this reasoning is that one therefore has to accept the plurality of living beings. There can't be just one living being if you're talking about that there's different kinds of avidya or ignorance, because if there's different kinds of ignorance, a living being may become free from some but not others. So if you take that kind of hypothesis, then it means that actually there have to be many living beings, because they're not all getting liberated at the same time. They can't. So it can't be one. It's nullifying that other hypothesis that there's only one living force. There has to be many living forces if there are many avidyas. So these are some of the hypotheses that are there, and particularly by the Advaita Mayavadis. So the same hypothetical reasoning is used by the Shrutis, as per Srila Vishwanath, in some of the Nyaya and Vaisheshikas, or in terms of the Nyaya and Vaisheshika claims. So this is another philosophical kind of theory that's there. And the Nyaya and Vaisheshika philosophical theory claims that the jiva soul is infinite in size. So it has to be, you can't even see an end to it. That's how big the soul is. And if souls were infinitesimal, they would not pervade their own bodies. So this is all this particular theory. So it's looking at the size of the jiva. If it's infinite in size, then that's one possibility. The second possibility is if they were teeny, infinitesimal, then they're saying that if they were so teeny, the soul couldn't pervade the whole body. So that's the thought of the Nyaya school. If they were of medium size, meaning the jiva, if it was of medium size, they're looking at the size of the soul. If the jiva, the spirit soul was of medium size. It couldn't be divided into parts, or it could be divided into parts, and so it wouldn't be eternal. So somehow they're concluding that, if the soul is divisible, then it can't last forever. It can't be eternal. So the conclusion that they reach is that the souls therefore have to be infinitely large. Somehow that's their conclusion. It doesn't work if you can't find an end to the soul. It doesn't work if the soul is so small, because then it can't spread throughout the body. This is their thinking. And therefore they're saying the conclusion is it has to just be very large. And this conclusion raises a question. With being infinitely large, how then can the jiva be covered by any power of bondage, whether it's avidya, some sort of illusory energy, or some kind of bondage that belongs to the Supreme Lord? So this is the reasoning that's there based on the hypotheses coming from the Nyaya school. So it's in this verse that the Shrutis explain that others do not accept the opinion of the Nyaya philosophers. So we're going to look at this a little bit closely, because Srila Vishwanath is drawing attention particularly to the Nyaya philosophy being refuted by this particular Shruti speaking here. So one can look at the pattern. So we're going to look more closely. I mean, my background was studying Western philosophy coming from Socrates. So that philosophy has very much to do with looking at the tools of thinking. So this is one particular tool of thinking that's been utilized here. And that is, there's a pattern of hypothetical syllogism, is what it's called, because there's a major premise. So the premise here, if we break it down, this is the premise. The size of the soul would show that it cannot be covered or be bound materially. That's the premise, actually, if you break down the Nyaya school of thought. So that fundamental premise has a particular fact, or if they take that as a fact, that the size of the soul will show that it cannot be covered or be bound materially. So this results in the following conclusion. The large size soul cannot be covered by any bondage, be it avidya or bondage belonging to the Supreme Lord. So they're just looking at size. So their premise is that the large size soul, it cannot be covered by any bondage. So this is a very, how would one say, like physical kind of way of looking at things. Almost material. You're talking about soul, but you've seen it in terms of a quantifiable size. So, so this is the particular premise, and it leads to that conclusion that actually, if it's so large size, it can't be covered by any ignorance. It's, it's like so large. That the size somehow makes it impervious to being covered. So in one sense, you could say that this premise has some iota of sense. Because Lord Krishna puts it this way. So Lord Krishna makes an interesting distinction, and that distinction can give some sort of sense to what this premise by the Nyaya school. Those who are seers of the truth have concluded that of the non-existent, the material body, there is no endurance, and of the eternal soul, there is no change. Thus, they have concluded by studying the nature of both. So notice the one thing that might give some semblance of sense to the Nyaya premise is the fact that they're trying to bring in the idea that the soul is in some sense unchanging. It can't be covered. It can't be covered. And this is correct from the point of view of Lord Krishna making the distinction, but it's a a distinction that's absent in the Nyaya school of thought. And that distinction that Lord Krishna is making is between the material body, which is called non-existent because it's so temporary, and the soul, which is eternal and has no change. So the missing component is that distinction. The Nyaya school is not making that distinction. They're looking very much almost from a kind of material perspective, just in terms of size. But they have the right idea to try and establish that the soul is unchanging or can't be bound by some sort of illusion. So that seems to make sense. So this distinction that Lord Krishna makes between the nature of the body and the nature of the soul, such that the spirit soul exists permanently, remaining the same despite all changes of the body. So that's the important part, that distinction that Lord Krishna makes. So the changes of the body are such that, and this is how Srila Prabhupada puts it, at every moment there are actions and reactions of the different cells. So that's what's making the body constantly changing. I mean, we may not be aware of it, but there's constant activity in the cells. There's change. Some are dying off. One reads that every 7 years there's a completely new set of cells. So it's constantly changing. So growth, because of this change, growth is happening. I mean, one witnesses in children, it's a known phenomenon. And one witnesses by observing somebody that you haven't seen for 20 years, and you see that age has set in. You know, they looked one way 20 years ago, and you see them now, and they're completely transformed. You know, the sparkle and the vibrancy of the skin is not there, or the fluidity of motion is not there. There's a kind of stilted movement, or the skin has a sallow look, or the eyes look very tired. So this is an indication that Lord Krishna's distinction between the non-existent body, so to speak, and the eternally existent soul is factually visible, at least in terms of the changes wreaked by time on the body. Now, if the Nyaya premise is correct, the conclusion should be correct. And Lord Krishna states this, because we're examining this closely, because Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur really draws attention to this. And Krishna says, the soul can never be cut to pieces by any weapon, nor burnt by fire, nor moistened by water, nor withered by the wind. So that's Bhagavad Gita 2:23. Nainam chindanti shastrani, nainam dahati pavaka, na chaimam kledayanta yapo, na sosyati maruta. It is in commenting on this statement of Lord Krishna that all weapons are unable to kill the soul, and he lists those weapons. Swords can't kill the soul, flame weapons can't kill the soul, rain weapons, tornado weapons. That it's in commenting on this that Srila Prabhupada says it very clearly. The Mayavadis cannot explain how the individual soul came into existence. Simply by ignorance, and consequently became covered by illusory energy. They can't explain it. This is what Srila Prabhupada puts it clearly, that there's some inability to fully explain. They can't explain how is it that there's some illusory energy that comes to cover the individual. And how did the individual jiva come into existence? They also can't explain that. It's not explained. So that's where the problem comes in even looking at what transpires, that, oh, you just examine the size of the jiva and you just conclude that the size would indicate it can't be covered. But what's the origin of that soul? That isn't explained. And how is it that actually there is some illusory energy that could possibly cover or not cover? It's not properly explained. So there's another point that Srila Prabhupada points out, that the Mayavadis, so this Nyaya school that Srila Vishwanath is looking at, it's never possible to cut the individual soul from the original supreme soul. So that's a very interesting point that Srila Prabhupada makes. It's never possible to cut the individual soul from the original supreme soul. Rather, the individual souls are eternally separated parts of the Supreme Lord. So you haven't severed the connection. They're still a part of the Supreme Lord. So that's a very, very interesting point. So it's got implications, that point. Because naturally, then if you're going to discuss the soul, you have to discuss the connection with the origin, the Supreme Lord. But that is not done. So because they are atomic individual souls eternally, they are prone to be covered by the illusory energy. That's actually the point. There's a tendency to be covered by the illusory energy due to the fact that they eternally existing, and therefore being separated from the association of the Supreme Lord becomes possible. Because there they are, eternally existing. There's a possibility of getting covered by the illusory energy because of taking on certain bodies. So there's always that possibility of getting separated from the Supreme Lord. So that's the explanation that Srila Prabhupada gives, which is very subtle, and it's completely bypassed by the Nyaya school. So the Nyaya conclusion lacks this understanding. The confusion is that with sizing being the determining factor for what makes a soul likely to come under the sway of illusory energy, they're merely looking at size. They're not looking at the origin of the soul, the connection with the Supreme Soul, the fact that the individual soul is eternally a separated part from the Supreme Soul, has a tendency, is prone to come under the sway of illusion. So there's a confusion. It's not clear on the part of the Mayavadi philosophers. So the critical understanding is that they're separated parts of the Supreme Soul. And the simile used by Srila Prabhupada is, and this was also mentioned in yesterday's class, just as the sparks of a fire, although one in quality with fire, are prone to be extinguished when out of the fire. So that's a simile that's used. This problem that comes from always being a separated part, but there's a possibility that you may lose the connection on the soul level with the Supreme Soul. So you have the same quality, but just like the little spark, same quality as the fire, but if you fall far away, then you're prone to be extinguished. So that spiritual spark needs to be kept alive by connection with the Supreme Soul. So Srila Vishwanath has the Shrutis continue in their examination and definition of the jiva, because that's this particular one. If the countless living entities, the embodied entities, which was the first word in this particular text, the embodied living entities, the parimita asankyata, and tanu brito, the embodied entities, rather than being generated from you, being equal to you, and also all-pervading, the scriptures would not say that they're under your control. So that is the argument. There's a whole body of literature that says that the individual spirit soul is under the control of the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Soul. So if, and this is the Mayavadi argument, if the countless living entities were actually equal to Lord Krishna, because remember, there's that whole idea that there's only one living force, which would make everyone equal to the Supreme Lord. If and the individual soul, if we were also all pervading, we could be everywhere at once, not just encased in one body, but we could also be in somebody else's body, in other bodies, be all over, then actually the scriptures would not be talking about the Supreme Lord being one who is controlling the individual soul. So Srila Vishwanath has the Shrutis say, "O Lord, you are perpetually in your original form and not otherwise." So note, not otherwise. You're perpetually in your original form. So the Shrutis, in their conditional reasoning, because we're looking at how the Nyaya school was reasoning, having their particular premise. So the premise of the Shrutis would be like this. If the embodied entities were not generated from you, they would be all pervading and equal to you. So that would be a premise that the Shrutis could make. If the embodied entities were not generated from you, they would be all pervading and equal to you. So that would be like the Mayavadi idea. There's one living force. So the minor premise is, and this is, again, the Shruti minor premise, but they are generated from you. So that's the important premise that the Shrutis make. And this is what's missing in the Mayavadi premise. The individual souls are generated from you. That's a premise. So this minor premise that they're generated from you leads to a conclusion. And the conclusion is, with the conditional reasoning that's been used, because that's what the Nyaya school was doing, it's using conditional reasoning. So we're doing the same thing. We're doing conditional reasoning with the Shrutis. So the conclusion with the conditional reasoning of the Shrutis is based on this minor premise. If the individual souls are generated from that supreme soul, then they would not be all-pervading, and then they would be under your control. So that's what the conclusion is. They are generated from the Supreme Lord. The individual souls are generated from the Supreme Lord. They're not all-pervading, and therefore they are under Krishna's control. So this is that, if you get your initial premise correct, you come to the correct conclusion. If you miss something in your initial premise, the conclusion is going to be something else. So you see the big contrast that was there. That's original premise from the Nyaya school. They're looking at the size of this individual soul. And they're concluding that actually if it's large, then it can't come under any illusion, whether that illusion belongs to the Supreme Lord or otherwise. And here, the emphasis is on the premise that actually the individual soul is generated from the Supreme Soul. So therefore, you have to conclude that they actually are always under the control of the Supreme Soul. And in the verse, the actual and purport, there was mentioned how, you can never, if you have a product, you have to consider that product is made up of its ingredients. You can't, I mentioned this in one class we were doing some way back on one of the Shrutis talking. As you go into a supermarket and you turn over all the many, many boxes that are there because there's so many packaged products. You turn over one and there's a listing of the ingredients. So whatever product is sitting in that box is made up of those ingredients. You can't say the product exists and, you ignore the ingredients. It's not possible. I mean, it's true, many of them may be chemical ingredients and some are natural, and so it may be partially an artificial product, but it exists because of the ingredients. So in the same way, the existence of the spirit soul has to be seen in relation to its origin. Where did the ingredients come from, so to speak? How did it come to be in its nice box of its body? You have to consider. So Srila Vishwanath has Lord Narayan ask a question of the Shrutis. So, it's like in any philosophical dialogue, there has to be careful thought given to what's being proposed, and one needs to ask a question. So Lord Narayan asks the questions, and this is Srila Vishwanath posing the question. Lord Narayan says, how is this? He just says, how is this? And the Shrutis reply in this way, and this is Srila Vishwanath saying how the Shrutis reply. Since the jiva comes into existence as an effect of Brahman, Brahman would be their controller. On account of being their source, he does not separate himself from the jiva. So that's a very profound response on the part of the Shrutis. And it's substantiated, this particular statement by Lord Krishna, meaning that the jiva comes into existence as an effect of Brahman. And this is how Lord Krishna puts it, and it substantiates this statement of the Shrutis from Bhagavad Gita 14.3. The total material substance called Brahman is the source of birth, and it is that Brahman that I impregnate, making possible the birth of living beings, O son of Bharata. So there's Krishna. It can be substantiated, the statement of the Shrutis. So the combination of material nature and the living entity is made possible by God himself. And the definition of Brahman is given by Srila Prabhupada. The Mahatattva is the total cause of the total cosmic manifestation. And that total substance of the material cause in which there are three modes of nature is sometimes called Brahman. So there's the definition of Brahman by Srila Prabhupada. The Mahatattva is the total cause of the total cosmic manifestation, and the total substance of the material cause in which there are those three modes of material nature is sometimes called Brahman. Because that was what Krishna was referring to, that Brahman is the total material substance. And Srila Prabhupada explains that the Supreme Personality of Godhead impregnates that Brahman, and thus innumerable universes become possible. So, one has to expand one's thinking because we're looking on a very huge scale. And the Supreme impregnates that Brahman with the seeds of the living entities, and that's the important part, because it's substantiating the Shrutis. On account of being their source, he does not separate himself from the jiva, and since the jivas come into existence as an effect of Brahman. So how they come into existence, that's explained by Krishna himself, and Srila Prabhupada expanding on it. The Supreme impregnates that Brahman with the seeds of the living entities. So there are 24 elements, earth, water, fire, air, etc. And they constitute what is known as the great Brahman. So the physical elements, the great Brahman, of course, the subtle mind, intelligence, etc. And the material nature, that's what the great Brahman is, that material nature. And the material nature in this connection is called Brahman because it is the perverted reflection of the spiritual nature. So you have to make that distinction. That's Brahman, that spirit, that material nature. It's not identical with the spiritual nature. It's a perverted reflection. So into this material nature, the superior energy, the living entity of the Lord, is mixed by his will. So that's the extraordinary explanation coming from Krishna and expanded by Srila Prabhupada. Finally, the point is made by the Shrutis that if someone were to ask what is known from that, then they say, because we've been trying to go through this, so what would you know from all of this? We've been trying to go in detail into this. And they put it this way: for those who say we know, it is for all intents and purposes unknown. And the word that's used is amalgam, unknown, because the Vedas say that the knowledge gained by sense perception is imperfect. So even for persons trying to look on an existential level through reasoning, it's still knowledge that's relying on sense perception, because even the discussion of the size of the soul and making conclusions based on the size that is trying to expand on something very subtle like illusion, not being able to cover it, is very much kind of using the senses. And this is what the Shrutis are finally concluding, that one cannot know because sense perception is imperfect. So actual knowledge requires a different field of study. And that field of study of the body is, or one has to study the body, the Kshetra, the owner of the body, and the knower of the field, the Supreme Lord, who knows both the body and the owner of the body. But it has to be studied with the help of the Vedas. So, for instance, we've been drawing a lot from Bhagavad Gita. And this is how knowledge is attained. You have to do it with the help of the existing scriptures. And that's how you attain knowledge. So there has to be a proper distinction made between the constitution of the body, the constitution of the individual soul, and the constitution of the super soul from Vedic literature. That's how you can know. And Lord Krishna says, you should understand that I'm also the knower of all bodies, and to understand this body and its knower is called knowledge. That is my opinion. To end on Lord Krishna saying, how do you actually know? So it's different if you're not actually consulting the Vedic scriptures that are consistently telling one that the individual soul is under the control of the Supreme Lord. So one has to come to understand this through studying the scriptures. One can understand this body. One can understand the knower of the body. And that is actually knowledge. So quite a sharp rebuke on the part of the Shrutis here for other philosophies that are not actually acknowledging the content of the Vedas and the emphasis of being under the control of the Supreme Lord, and actually understanding that the individual soul is actually coming as a separated part of the Supreme Lord and has got a tendency to fall into illusion because of its eternality, in some sense, the tendency to take on many, many bodies because of being in the material nature and the susceptibility to falling under illusion. So that was an attempt to look at the statement of the Shrutis. If there's some thought to expand the discussion or some insight to add to it, please feel free.
I was just wondering that the illusion that you're talking about, that the living entity is overcome by the illusion. They they are so illusion. They are studying the Shrutis. They come about with a different understanding. They propound their philosophies also. They are arguing on that, and yet they cannot understand. Who is bigger? The illusion is bigger. The living entity is, bigger. The living entity is undergoing the illusion.
That's a very interesting point. Just actually looking at how great the illusion can be, that and that illusion has a lot to do with holding on to perceptual reality. Because one has to a large extent to let go of hypothetical reasoning that is just using either the external perceptual reality or the strength of one's intellect. Because the actual breakdown or removal of that illusory curtain only comes with opening up oneself to the authorized statements of the Vedas, reading them as they are put through the realization of the acharyas who have studied them and come to truly understand and are hence reiterating Krishna's message. Just like Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who gives so much insight into this statement of the Shrutis through reinforcing the teachings of Lord Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. I'm drawing from it, and he's not making statements from Bhagavad Gita, but the connection is very, very clear just because he's giving insight. His insights are coming from a knowledgeable source, so it's very easy to connect. So that illusory curtain, just based on perceptual reality, externally studying just through one's perceptions, and then utilizing the power of one's intellect, isn't sufficient. It's not sufficient. Yeah. So indeed, it's a huge curtain of reality if one holds on to perceptual reality and holds on to the power of one's own intellect. Because it requires a certain surrendering of one's idea of oneself as an intellectual to be able to accept the teachings from the Vedas. I mean, that's why one reads of scholars. One scholar will put out a paper and another scholar will refute it. I mean, I have numerous philosophical books when I was studying philosophy, and every one of them is the particular philosopher is refuting this particular statement from another philosopher, that particular statement from another philosopher. And why is that? It's because there's that necessity to assert the power of one's own intellect. I mean, there's a certain pride component, certainly. So, yeah, the surrendering, the willingness to surrender to another source of knowledge, and never mind to be able to accept that there's a supreme being who one is dependent on for knowledge. That clearly is quite a large amount of surrender if one is holding on to the power of one's own intellect. So, well, thank you so very much for your kind attention. And thank you very much for attending the class. It's much appreciated in a large temple room. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.